So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Muskingum County Social Justice Coalition uh, Community Education Series. I'm excited to begin the second module, the first installment of our second module in our series. Our first module was about culture and some of the elements of culture and different perspectives on culture. So as we begin our second module, our focus will be race and racism and allyship. So I'm excited to let you know that as we continue to deliver on what we promised, which was local folks who have an interest in what goes on in Muskingum County and the Zanesville community, but also have an interest in a broader sense of educating folks around the issues of culture and race and diversity, and are prepared to do so as a part of our ongoing series. So we appreciate you being here. We appreciate your time and attention. And our presenter for tonight is Miss Marilyn McCollum. Marilyn is an assistant professor of education at Muskingum University in New Concord. Her fields of specialization are multicultural education and diversity, cross-cultural communication, and TEFL. I'm not sure what that is. I apologize. She holds a master's in applied linguistics from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, a master's in education in bilingual education from the University of Texas at El Paso, and is currently pursuing her educational doctorate in diversity and equity in education from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Maryland's focus of study centers on education and indigenous populations in North America, specifically intergenerational trauma as a result of native residential boarding school era. So I present to you Ms. Marilyn McCollum. Marilyn?
Thank you so much, Daryl. I appreciate it, and I appreciate the invitation to come speak here. So TEFL is teaching English as a foreign language, and TESOL is teaching English to speakers of other languages.
Thank you. I apologize.
That's what those are. No, you're fine. You're fine. So the topic tonight is how we got here. And they've asked me to talk a little bit about the emergence of racism. And so, okay, this is just my introduction. You don't need that. So one of the things that I wanted to start out with is a disclaimer, and that is the idea that we see the world through our own cultural lenses, and those have been, cultivated through our upbringing and through, other cultural influences. And those tend to focus on our own cultural identities and circumstances. Now, those are things that can change, with time, but we still tend to see the world through those cultural lenses. So I think it's important to examine one's positionality. And so in terms of my positionality, I am a white woman. And so I tend to view the world kind of through that white female cultural lens. And, I understand that my experiences are not going to be the same as other individuals, right? But what I can do is understand my positionality, understand and listen to the experiences of others. And I think that's important to really open your mind, open your heart, and open your ears to the experiences and perspectives of other people, to hear their life experiences and perspectives. And in doing that, you can kind of reshape your view of the world. So I think that as I went through the process of kind of trying to understand myself, I'm from New Concord. I grew up here. I like to tell people that I escaped for about 10 or 12 years and lived in the South, in Pensacola and then in Raleigh, North Carolina. But, I want to remain open so that I can really listen to other people's stories. And that helps me to better understand, and none of us are monolithic. When we talk about cultures in general, there are stereotypes out there, obviously, and there are generalizations that can be made. But it's important to understand that no one person speaks for an entire race or an entire ethnicity or entire group of people. And that comes down to this idea of intersectionality, which is that we're all made up of a lot of different cultural identities, and where those intersect is where our experiences are different from others. And all of these experiences are important, and they're worth hearing and respecting. So that was my disclaimer that the things that I'm going to talk about tonight are historical. Um, and, I just wanted to make sure that I had discussed my positionality with that. I kind of broke down this presentation into 3 areas. So where we are now, and then how we got here, and where do we go from here. Um, and so one of the things I went back to was the beginning of the country, right? That's not the entry point, or the point where things developed, but I think people look at the Declaration of Independence as that main document that kind of set everything up for where we are. And one of the things about that is that we claim to be a society created on equity, right? Equality, that all men are created equal, and that everyone is to be full citizens. And I think many of us realize that that is not the reality. And some of us realize that that wasn't even the intention. Um, and so when you realize that that wasn't the intention, that's a real gut punch. um, so I just put a quote in here from the Declaration of Independence. I know you've seen it before. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So one of the things you have to think about is, how did we get from this statement, this strong statement of equality, to the inequalities that exist today? And there are so many inequalities in many different areas of life. So that was kind of what I started thinking about. How did we get from that to where we are now? And I would say, and the whole premise of what I'm going to talk about tonight is that we really haven't gotten anywhere. And I think in order for us to progress, we really need to open our eyes and take a look at the things that have happened historically, the policies, the barriers that were put in place, the power structures that exist today. And I think that's something that many people in this country have a hard time doing, but that's something that's in a necessity. Right? So how did we get here? We've always been here, I think. And as I was working on this presentation, that thought really kind of cemented um, in my head that we it, the meme. There's a meme out now that will show 2 pictures, right? This is how it started, and this is how it's going. And so I kind of envision the same picture for the U.S., right? That we really haven't progressed in enough areas, right? So we've always been here. A lot of that started with colonization. And this is not something that's unique to the United States. It's not even unique to English-speaking countries. This is based on a power structure, and the powerful countries that came in and invaded and colonized other countries set up that same power structure. So we see a lot of the same issues in the US that we've seen in Canada, that we've seen in the UK, that we see in Australia and in other countries. So, I think it all started with colonization, right? Because those ideas were disseminated, and those ideas were centered on a superiority of one group over others, right? So before Europeans came to the continent, I mean, we know that there were already numerous indigenous tribes that lived in this area, that occupied this area, and I did a search to kind of find out how many, and most of the researchers don't agree on an exact number because we'll never know. But a number of estimates said that there were more than 60 million natives in North America um, before Columbus landed. Of course, he didn't land in I mean, he landed in the islands. He didn't land on the mainland. Um, but one of the things he brought with him was European diseases. And so those European diseases really decimated the native populations that were here. In the writings of people who were on that voyage, there are many accounts of how the natives were savages. They needed saving. And this is kind of an age old story. Um, they needed somebody to teach them how to be civilized. Um, and so, you know, Columbus and the crew ended up taking some of those natives to Europe as slaves, right? So that was one of the things that happened there. And then, any subsequent expedition that arrived, it was a similar practice. And then if we look a little bit farther down the line, right, 100 years, 200 years later, we've got the introduction of slavery into the Americas, and that was a very obvious power structure that was brought, and that was brought everywhere that slaves were brought. There was this power structure that was set up. You see it in many different countries, and so that kind of allowed it to strengthen over the years. And then the third area that I thought was important to look at was the waves of immigration. And this country has had three distinct waves of immigration, um, different times, but similar groups of people coming for different reasons. And so that introduced this kind of foreign element, um, and opportunities to um, make white people feel superior to others, and to introduce those power structures and to keep those happening. So, my answer of how did we get here is it started here. We're here. Right. We're still in the same place, unfortunately. So one of the things I wanted to show was, this is a map of our graphic of of North America. And these were where native tribes occupied. And I say occupied, not owned, because most native tribes have such a connection to and respect of the earth and of land that they don't have the concept of owning land in their languages and cultures. In fact, that was one of the things that the U.S. government wanted of natives, was to turn them into landowners. Well, this is not something that was this was just a completely foreign concept to them. So they lived and kind of moved around, but they occupied large parts of North America. And so I wanted to show this. I know it's probably a little bit hard to see, but I mean, it shows that the continent had, numerous native tribes that lived there. Right. So that brings me to first contact with Europeans. So this is kind of an age-old story too, and these are things that did not just happen to the natives or indigenous populations in the United States. This happened to indigenous peoples across the globe in terms of colonization, right? One of the first things that happened was that the indigenous peoples were branded as savages. And that was initially because, well, not initially, but this was because the Europeans didn't understand their ways, right? And so the immediate response was, they're savages, they're inferior, and they'll always be inferior. And so how do we fix that? Well, we introduce them to religion, right? And through religion and through learning European ways, excuse me, they're going to be able to become more civilized, and they're going to, they're going to be people that we can work with, right? And again, this is something that is continued throughout history, right? And there are multiple accounts of how Euro-Americans or Europeans, when they came over, really didn't understand native practices, and because they didn't understand them, they kind of feared them, or felt that they needed to change. They labeled them as lesser, right? But they did find some things, even though they didn't admit it at the time. the Iroquois had a confederacy, and it was a group of, I want to say, 5 or 6 different tribes, different groups in that area, and they had a very functional constitution and a checks and balances set up. Is this sounding familiar? And so some of what is in the U.S. Constitution really was, um, came into being because of the Iroquois Confederacy, right? And it's only been relatively recently that that's been discovered, right? That they had a highly organized structure, but the main issue was the Europeans didn't understand it, right? And I think they didn't understand it, and so they feared it. They wanted to change it. So the native tribes, native populations had we when Daryl did my introduction, he talked about intergenerational trauma, and this is something that you'll see throughout each of these groups. But intergenerational trauma is traumatic experiences that are so traumatic, um, that are so life shaping, that they tend to mold not just one individual, but multiple generations. If they're not addressed. And this is something that many Native peoples have experienced, unfortunately. Without getting into a long history of this, essentially, um, the when the U.S. became the U.S., the colonies became the United States. Um, in time, there was this idea of manifest destiny, that it was our destiny to move west and to conquer. And so, in order to fulfill that destiny, essentially what happened was all of the native populations were literally and physically pushed to the west. And it took a while, but by the mid 1800s, well, it was right before the Civil Wars. So between 1850 and 1860 or so, um, many of them were pushed out west, and many of them were kind of stripped of their cultural practices, their languages. I'm sure you've heard of the Indian Removal Act that happened by Andrew Jackson in the 1830s, or the Trail of Tears. And that was forcible removal of native populations. And a lot of that was because um, the U.S. wanted land for its citizens, right? And so what they did was they just pushed the natives aside, and they became the Indian problem. A lot of um, authors and people at the time referred to it as the Indian problem. What are we going to do about the Indian problem? So, when they couldn't get native peoples to stop fighting back, they came up with some really sketchy policies, forcible policies to keep them from fighting back. So a lot of that was in stripping people of their ancestral lands, putting them on reservations. When they initially put native tribes on reservations, of course, there was some pushback. And so as a result of that, because the natives were still fighting for their ways of life, the U.S. government came after their children. And I know this sounds bad to say came after their children, but that was essentially what happened. There was a man by the name of Richard Henry Pratt, who had been in the I think the cavalry or the army. But he had an experiment where he managed a prison, and it was a prison for native prisoners of war. And he decided that he could educate these natives, and turn them not into savages, but into, kind of save them. And so when this experiment became more successful, he decided that he wanted to open a boarding school, and do the same thing with the children. And the idea was they could not get all of the native adults um, to capitulate, to accept American ways. And so they believed that through education they could educate the native out of them. And the quote by Pratt was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." And that was exactly what he did. He ran that residential boarding school like a military academy. And what he did was they took children. So, for instance, the one that he started was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and it was called Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And they took Native children from North and South Dakota and out, in the Great Plains, and brought them to Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And part of the reason they did that is so that the kids couldn't run away, and they couldn't go home for the summer. So this was really a camp where these kids were going to have the native parts of them educated out, um, because they couldn't get the adults to listen, right, to obey. So this was a horrible, horrible thing that happened, and I mean, Carlisle was not the only one; it was the first, and there are tons of them across the United States. I'm sure that you've heard of the Kamloops discovery in Canada that happened, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago, where 215, well, the remains of 215 children, Native children, were found on the site of this Canadian residential boarding school. And so this is a trauma that has not ended for Native peoples. And these schools were in operation up until, I think, the mid 1980s. There is one school that is still open. It does not run the same way. And I know a lot of people were shocked by this discovery, and maybe some were thinking, well, we didn't do that to, our Native peoples. And yes, we did. And so, I saw on Facebook people were saying, well, I wonder if this happened in the United States. Yes, it did. Will they find bodies in the United States? I'm sure that they will. So it was a horrible, horrible experience. There was a lot of physical, emotional, sexual abuse. There was, these kids went to school, um, and they were taught geography, they were taught English, they were not allowed to speak their native language, they were physically punished for that. They had their hair cut to kind of, and for Native peoples, the length of their hair, the longer their hair is, the closer they're connected to the earth. So cutting a Native person's hair is, it's not something that is just done lightly, right? So this was uh, a direct attempt to kind of break that connection to the Native language. And as you can see the picture on this slide, um, this is a young man who I believe went to Carlisle Indian Industrial School, and you see he's in his Native clothing when he got there, and then he was put in Western clothing, and that was presumably when he started there. So, these are horrible things that have happened, but a lot of it was based on the fact that somebody believed that natives were inferior, and that in order to be able to survive, they were going to need to be able to adopt white ways. And then that's also why there was a great deal of resistance to it. White ways and native ways, and when I say native, I don't mean all natives, right? Because they're not monoliths either. Every tribe operated differently, and had different cultural practices. Some were shared, but most of them were different. So this is an experience that happened to many people in the tribes, and it continues. It's kind of passed down. That trauma is passed down today. And if you look, this is something that circulated on Facebook, and it actually is real. It actually happened. This is a letter from an Indian mission in South Dakota, which is where the Lakota tribe, the Sioux, are. And this is somebody from the church, the mission school, who was selling Native children for $10. So in 1952, um, you could buy an Indian child for $10. So, and I wanted to show you this because this really is indicative of how people saw Native Native children and Native peoples in general. You know, in the industrial schools, these children were schooled in English ways for a few hours in the morning, and then in the afternoon they were learning their place in society, right? So the girls were learning domestic skills, where the boys would learn, you know, farming and animal husbandry and things like that. And um, they ended up, there were internships, and these internships really were a clever way for um, the schools to keep the natives there instead of going home. But it also kind of taught them to accept their place, um, what the whites determined was their place in society, or would be their place in society. And as a result of that, many of the individuals who actually left the schools and tried to go back to their tribes, their connection with the tribes was severed, and so this really had long-lasting impacts on them. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is slavery, right? And that is the second kind of big thing that happened, that illustrated that there was a power structure going on in this idea of white supremacy. And I wanted to bring up the fact that race is not a biological thing. Race is a social construction, and it was created by um, white individuals, right, to characterize others. So this, you know, this idea of race is not something that, there's no gene that identifies it. This is completely a social construct. And you can see through these stories the damage that's been done by that social construct, right? So 1619 tends to be the year when we really think of slavery starting in North America, although there are some, you know, people that would argue that even 2 centuries before it had started, right? And so um, you know, the enslaved peoples were not treated like human beings. They were considered inferior. They were actually labeled as 3/5 of a person. And when they were brought here, they were segregated. So they were only used um, for work, right? And so, you know, this really set up the idea of one group is superior to another. Okay. And even after slavery was abolished, you know, there were freedmen who, when they went north, you know, and tried to um, live in society, and they were not equals. So this is not, I think we tend to think of this as something that happened in the South and only in the South, but that's not true. It's something that happened everywhere. And as such, they were not allowed that same participation that white people had, and actually white men had. So, um, you know, I think back and think, what? How did this start? Why did it start? And it's hard to reason that, other than, you know, this country was built on that. Even the people that we think of as the founding fathers, and the people um, in this country think of as the leaders or great people, they had slaves. They, you know, slavery was something that was done. It was common, but that doesn't excuse it, right? The idea of owning another human being um, is just ludicrous. And so I think we have to come to terms with that as well. The fact that this happened, and that the founding fathers, you know, slavery was, that's how this country was built. Um, and they knew, first of all, they knew it was a fragile system. And that was um, in the Civil War, that became clearer, right? That it was an incredibly fragile system. But you know, they didn't put it in the Constitution, because they knew that if they didn't have slavery, um, you know, they couldn't keep this country going. So that's something that's important to understand and realize, that slavery was a huge part of how the United States began, and it was a conscious thing. right? You know, so um, when we talk about the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln freeing the slaves, that was not something, and this goes back to perspective. So I grew up here in Ohio, went to school, and I was always taught that the Civil War was fought over slavery. There was never any question about that. It was always about slavery. When I did my undergraduate degree in Pensacola, Florida, which is part of the Bible Belt, we called it Southern Alabama because essentially it was like 15 miles from the Alabama border. But I had a professor there, and he had us read a couple of books on slavery. One was called The Klansman, and I was appalled by it. And we had a discussion in class about it, and he mentioned the War of Northern Aggression, and I said, the what? The War of Northern Aggression? What is that? And I said, you mean the Civil War? He said, no, it was the War of Northern Aggression. And I said, you mean the one that was fought over slavery? And he said, no, it was fought over states' rights. Right. So one of the things I learned early on, was that we are taught different things in different areas of the country. And there are certain parts of history that are overlooked or pushed aside in favor of other perspectives. So that was kind of my first glimpse into that happening. And since then, I've made it a point to pay attention to other perspectives and really see, because you know these things are not being taught in school, right? So as far as the African American experience in the U.S., and again, this is one, being white, I'm looking at this through a different cultural lens. And it's not firsthand knowledge, but these are things that I have learned, and and really have found very important, right? I remember a couple of years ago, Dr. Ben Carson, who was in the Trump administration, he was the HUD secretary, I believe. He gave a speech and he talked about the immigrant experience. And when he talked about the immigrant experience, he talked about the African American immigrant experience. And I found that really interesting because African Americans were not voluntary immigrants to the United States. I mean, they were brought here against their will, right? So, of course, there's a different, it's a different experience. It's not the same. We're so excited to come to the United States. That's a very different experience. So I think when we look at the experience, we need to understand that as well, that they were involuntary immigrants, and as such, they were not given the same rights and ability to kind of participate in full society. And this was really evident. I mean, obviously, it was evident through the Civil War. One of the things that I didn't know about, but have learned, that there were literacy laws on the books. And this goes to slavery being such a fragile system, that if enslaved peoples learned how to read and write, they could forge their own passes to freedom. And this was known. In fact, there were slave owning families who did everything they could to keep any kind of news um, away from slaves, because they knew that if the slaves read this, they would see that it wouldn't take long for them to realize that this was wrong, right, and to rise up. So a lot of this supremacy is also fear. I think that's another thing that plays a very, very important role in this. So, and we know how there are policies put into effect. In some cases they were covert, but now they're just kind of becoming overt. So, the things that are happening in Georgia right now with the Voting Rights Act, they're making it harder for people to vote, and that's all because um, you know the votes would be different, right? If they let everybody vote, and that's a threat to them. So these practices continued. A couple of the things that I really found just abhorrent. Um, One of those was the treatment of African American soldiers that fought for the United States in World War II. And near the end of World War II and after World War II, they came up with the GI Bill, which is um, the bill that allows former soldiers to go to school and to take loans out to get houses and things like that to rebuild their lives. And specifically in the southern states, the people who controlled the disbursement of these benefits made it impossible for African American soldiers returning to take advantage of those benefits. And that's something um, that really struck a chord with me. Um, you know, and these are things that happened 70 years ago. And so this was not a long time ago. And we see these things still happening now. So um, yeah, it's awful. And the last thing I wanted to talk about has to do with the waves of immigration. So in the beginning, when the United States became a country, and of course before, when they were colonies, there was pretty much open immigration, and people could come from wherever, but they really came just from England. um, and we start to see after that a couple different waves, and there are people coming from other countries for a variety of reasons. So, in the late 1800s, you have an influx of immigrants from Ireland coming, and that's a direct result of the power structure that it was occurring in Ireland at the time, where um, there were wealthy landholders that owned everything, and you had Irish peasants who worked the farms and grew crops and things like that. Well, when the potato blight hit and killed their crops, it killed them not just 1 year, but it killed them for several years. Not only did those farmers not have enough to pay their rent or to sell, they didn't have enough food for themselves. So, you have a large wave of immigrants from Ireland coming. And when those immigrants came, and we think now, um, I don't know how many Ancestry.com commercials I've seen where people are really excited to find out that they're Irish, or when it comes to St. Patrick's Day, everybody wants to be Irish. Um, and initially, um, they were discriminated against as well. They were blamed for diseases that came. They were thought of as poor. People didn't want them as employees. So, and every group had that. Every group that came over faced some kind of discrimination, um, either that they were responsible for some sort of disease. They would blame it on the immigrant rather than the fact that there was no sanitation in large cities, and diseases spread that way. Um, so they were kind of the fall guy in a way. Um, so, in some cases, immigrants were also seen as threatening the American way of life. We have a stereotype of the model minority, and you've probably heard of that in terms of Asian students, or Asian immigrants. And part of the reason is because when they came here, um, they tended to not question things. They were seen as quiet, and they would obey, and so they were seen as the model minority. So that was a stereotype that wasn't exactly positive um, for them either. So what America wanted of immigrants was that they would come here and, first of all, they would resemble the people who were already here, that they would have similar beliefs, that they wouldn't rock the boat, right? And when things got a little bit too, and I don't know how to put this, but when things got a little too ethnic, um, the United States government came up with a quota system, and they took a census in 1924 and determined how many of what groups of immigrants they would allow come into the United States. So there were limits put. In fact, I want to say it was 1883, there was a Chinese Exclusion Act. There was in the late 1800s, when gold was found in California and you had the gold rush, a lot of Chinese immigrants were actually invited to come here to help pan for gold. Well, when the gold kind of ran dry or ran out, um, the the people who were operating these um, these gold mines didn't want to share, right, so to speak. So um, they decided that they were going to put a ban on the number of Chinese immigrants coming in. So that was one of the first things that happened. A lot also in terms of fear, um, you will see in times of increased immigration, you will see an increased move towards nationalism. And we saw this with 9/11, where the Americans kind of came together, but part of what we were coming together to do was um, was to have anti-Muslim sentiment, Islamic sentiment. We saw this in World War II with the Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans were rounded up shortly after Pearl Harbor was bombed, rounded up and put into internment camps. And we think of concentration camps, right? We think of the Holocaust and Hitler and Nazi Germany and the horror that was there, but we had horrors in our own country that we need to acknowledge as well, right? And part of the challenge of the United States is that we are not a country that is kind of connected to ethnicity, and we never have been, right? Anybody can come here and be an American, and that's not true in other countries, right? So that's one of the things I think um, that makes immigration a bit challenging, right? Is that when you have people coming in from different ethnicities, different areas, you do have this intense feeling of you can come here but don't change us, or you can come here but you have to be like us. So immigrant experiences in the U.S. are very, very different as well, right? We've had so many different immigrants from so many different areas. Recently, if you look at the immigrant experience, right now on the southern border, you have people coming to seek asylum, and you have people from Guatemala, people from El Salvador, places in South America and Central America that are fleeing, and they're mainly children, but they're fleeing horrible circumstances in their home countries. That's a very different experience from other immigrant experiences in the past. There's so much turmoil in the world that we have a lot more people that are wanting to come here as refugees, right? And this happened with Syria as well. Syria is just, it's there's almost nothing left of it. And imagine that group that has to flee so that they can live, and then try to find refuge in a place that says we don't want you here, right? And this happened in Europe as well, not just the United States, but I tend to think of those individuals. And one of the things I think that's challenging about Americans is sometimes I don't think we consider what it's like to be on the other side, because many of us haven't had to think about that. But I think that's a critical thing, right? So yeah, that's the Japanese American experience. Obviously, during World War II, that was another experience. And I'll show you a couple of slides here that show. But these were people who were in the United States. They had children that were born in the U.S. They were living, productive lives, and they were becoming Americans, so to speak. But yet they were rounded up and suspected right away of, you know, um, working as spies, even though there was no evidence that occurred. And so this is just propaganda that has come out that I wanted to just show it, because some of these things I had not seen before. I'd seen the Irish, the whites only, right? We don't serve Spanish or Mexicans. The Islamic Center, the graffiti that's on there, that's relatively recent. But one of the things that I found very interesting is these two pictures on the left. I have a professor, my advisor actually at UIUC, and she did her dissertation and her work on the Asian American experience in the U.S. So she actually talked about and wrote a book about the experiences of Japanese American children who were put in internment camps. So on the left here, this is an image that was put in one of the papers, and it was how to tell a Chinese person from a Japanese person. And some of these things actually were, Chinese Americans were putting these things out to save themselves, right? They actually had buttons made for their children to wear that said, "I am not Japanese." So and as I was going through looking at these photos, um, there was a lot of offensive propaganda that, can you tell, Japanese person from a Chinese person? And so you know, these are supposed to be the characteristics, right? So that you can tell who's your enemy and who's you're not. And that's, this next um, poster was the same way. This is a Chinese person, not a Japanese person. He's your friend. He fights alongside of you. So, um, these are things that I hadn't known. I mean, I knew about the internment camps, but when Pearl Harbor was attacked, I didn't necessarily think about the, you know, the immigrant groups or the Asian immigrant groups that were not Japanese, what they went through trying to prove that they were not Japanese. So I wanted to kind of add that in also, right? So back to the question of how did we get here? Um, I think simply it was colonization. And what colonization did was it allowed people, and they were white European people, Christians, to come here and kind of impose their will or impose what their values were. And the typical Euro-American values are individualism, material wealth, hard work, competition, self-reliance, and equality of opportunity. I think individualism is probably one of the more significant values, because when you put that next to collectivism, for instance, Native tribes are collectivist and they are more concerned with the cohesion of the group than they are about the individual. And that's true still today. But, one of the things that we see about at least white Americans and other Americans that individualism is important. We are taught at a very early age to be our own people, to care about ourselves, and our immediate family. But that's a very big difference, right? And it creates a cultural mismatch. And then you have material wealth. In terms of native tribes, they weren't concerned with money. In fact, when their land was taken by the U.S., it was taken because they found gold in the Black Hills. And the Black Hills to the Lakota tribe is a very sacred place. It's part of their origin story, and it's very important to them. And the Americans wanted, the government wanted that because after the Civil War, they didn't have any money. The government didn't have any money. So they thought if they could, if they found gold there, they could take that gold and, they could use that money to pay off debts. Whereas if you look at it from the Native perspective, that is a very sacred place to them. So, the American government ended up taking control of the Black Hills, and that's in fact where Mount Rushmore is. And I think it was in the 1990s or early 2000s, or it might have been in the 80s. The U.S. government had stated, we we never should have taken it. So they didn't give it back, but they tried to compensate the Native tribes for that. And I think there's something like $6 million um, on hold that the government has for um, the Lakota Nation. And I don't, if you've ever seen any pictures of some of the reservations, Pine Ridge Reservation is one of the poorest reservations it's one of the poorest places in the country, right? So, they could easily have a different life if they took that money, but it's not about money, right? And that's the one thing I think that Europeans didn't understand about Native peoples is that the values are not the same. And for other groups, right? For African Americans, for Asian Americans, it's not about material wealth, right? It's about things that are more of value to them than money, right? But essentially, that became the norm. The European whites, um, that value system became the norm, and it's still kind of considered the norm today. And it's been imposed on others, and like I said, it brings forth a cultural mismatch a lot of the time, and you get people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds that are held to these standards or these norms when those norms don't apply to them, right? So, also in terms of how did we get here, power is one thing. It's a great motivator, and I think we've seen this in a number of cases that people who are in power, the one thing they're afraid of is losing that power. And in order to stay in power, they're going to do whatever they can to keep it, right? And that manifests itself in a number of different ways, right? But typically marginalization and oppression. One of the things that tends to follow then is othering, and that's a divisive strategy where you have an us versus them. And so a lot of these things, as I was putting this presentation together and thinking about, each one of these groups has been victim of othering, and there have been very clear strategies to make people see them as other, right? And so when you're able to do that, when you're able to have this us versus them, then it becomes a lot easier. And that's a vehicle for fear and hatred to spread. And those are things that are fueled very easily. And it's easier, I think, to fear and hate someone or something than it is to get to know them and to kind of work through feelings and to come to a place of acceptance, right? But that's something that we need to do and we haven't managed to do yet. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, that's my main focus. And that's very critical. But in order to get to a place where you can implement these things, you have to be able to see through a different cultural lens. And I think that's one of the challenges that this country faces is being able to do that and being able to learn the perspectives of others, especially because many of those perspectives are left out. So some of the things I talked about today, you may have heard about or you may have learned about. A lot of these things that I'm talking about are things that I learned as an adult. They were not things that were taught in school, and they should have been. And so I think that having the control over what's taught or not taught in schools is critical. And you see this going on as well with the argument against critical race theory. Critical race theory is a framework. It's a framework to understand the experiences of others rather than looking at it through a white cultural lens, a lens that is mismatched from who you're kind of looking at. And that's critical. And there are people who have banned it, states that have banned it, that they don't want um, to be, they want their kids taught about racism and things like that. So again, here we have these things hidden, right? But we need to know that. We need to know that true history. We need to know the different perspectives, the perspectives of different events that have happened, right? And we know it's political. Education is political. There's no way that it's not going to be political. Um, and I think we have to realize that and challenge that, right? And finally, I think, if we're going to make any kind of progress, we have to come to terms with things that have happened in the historical past, right? Even though, I'm myself am not responsible for all the, these things that I'm telling you about. However, um, it's my responsibility to open my eyes and see them for what they were and see the impact of them on people today. And that helps me kind of reframe how I see the world and how I move forward in the future. Right? So thank you. I'm sure that was more than 30 minutes. I apologize for that, but I appreciate you letting me share some of this. And I think we're going to open it up for discussion. And I'm happy to facilitate or happy to answer any questions. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Marilyn.
Good.
We have to go, but any questions, any points of discussion, anything that folks want to hear a little bit more about or engage in some discussion about with Marilyn facilitating our conversation?
I appreciated, this is Christine, and
Christine.
I so appreciated the history in such a clear, I don't know how you did it in that short of time. I know you've got, I think I went over, but it was like bite-sized chunks that I could wrap my mind around.
Oh,
so
good.
How you walked us through that.
Sure, you're welcome. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just looked down and saw it was an hour, so I'm sorry about the length of it, but
you're fine. No problem.
Yeah,
no apologies. It was fantastic.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, these things, there's a lot more that I could have talked about. You have to, you have to kind of limit it into smaller chunks. But I think that the main thing I wanted to get across was that we've had things in this country that have happened, and they've happened to many different groups of people. So it's not, it's not just the experience of one group, right? So you can't say, well, African Americans have had a different experience or have had a negative experience. It is, yes, that is true. But I guess what I'm saying is this idea of white superiority and supremacy is not just focused on African Americans, right? It was focused on natives. It was, so this is, um, you know, when we think about structural racism, systemic racism, this is across the board. And that's, I think, the idea that I wanted to get past. And you see it specifically in education, inequities in education that favor middle class white students. So, yeah. But I'm glad I was able to make it a little bit more easily digestible.
I think one of my observations from your presentation, and we've had recent ones on cultures and how cultures may be different, is that like your example in Florida, where the war of northern aggression is such a different way of looking at that war, and the reasons for the war and so on. That there are people that absolutely believe that it's just not rhetoric. What we don't do very well in this country is listen, and that we assume that everybody's coming at every issue from the same perspective, and we're not. And we dig our heels in on our perspective, and we we just we don't want to hear another perspective. So I'm curious as to what you would think it would take for us Americans to be better listeners.
That's a great question. And I think one of the first things that needs to happen, I think, is we have to be able to accept the things that have happened in the past and understand that, I wasn't here in 1492 when Columbus landed. I wasn't here in 1851 when the first of many native U.S. government treaties were signed and not honored, right? But but these are things that are important and things that have lasting effects, right? And so for me, I have to be open to say, yes, these things happen. I mean, I think that's the first thing, to acknowledge that they happen. And that's, if you look at critical race theory and the firestorm around critical race theory, a lot of it's misunderstood because the theory itself is misunderstood by the people that are trying to ban it. There are critical race theories not just focused on African American individuals, but there's a tribal critical race theory, there's an Asian critical race theory, there's a feminist critical race theory. So, and all of it has to do with these perspectives, right? Is viewing a person's experience, with those kind of understandings. And so I think that the important thing is to not be afraid of the past and not try to hide it, but to accept it, right? And in order to accept it, I think we have to be taught. We have to learn what things have happened, and we have to see the different perspectives. So I think the first thing is that these things need to be taught, but also we need to be willing to accept them, that these things have happened, and to figure out ways to move on. I mean, not, and when I say move on, I mean to figure out how to attack them, if that makes sense, right? So if we acknowledge that something has happened, and this is a journey I've been taking over the last couple of years in my grad program, is learning all these things that have happened in the past that I was never taught. So what do I do with that information? What I do with the information is I tell my students, right? And my students, I have students that don't realize that we have reservations still, and that there are Native people still living living in the United States, right? But let alone living on reservations. So I think that that there needs to be some acceptance of things that have happened, and then how are we going to approach this to make things better in the future? But I think that's where it starts, is to be willing, to get the information and be willing to hear it and understand it, and then determine how can we move forward and change things. Does that answer your question?
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks.
That's really hard to disagree with. This is Jim.
Hey, Sam.
The only thing, food for thought, I would throw in is I tend to be a lot more cynical than you are. I think there are a lot more sophisticated moves behind the scenes to continue to hang on to power. For one thing, I think we don't tax wealth in this country, so it's no accident we have a big gap between the needy and the extreme wealthy. I mean, these people aren't idiots. They know that they're becoming a part of a minority class. They may be the dominant minority, but they're not going to be the majority before long. So there are always controlling factors. There are always greedy factors. It's been true since day one, all the way up through present. And there's sinister things behind the scene. Every time some common sense point of view comes forth on the internet or wherever, in teaching circles, whatever, there's always a sinister plot to label it. It's got to be Marxist. It's got to be socialism. It's got to be hate. To put it down right away, the CRT's got a nice brand now. You know, it's socialism, it's communism.
Yep.
You know, it's just all that control behind the scenes.
That I agree with you completely, and that's, you know, it's hard sometimes. I mean, I teach entry level education students, multicultural education, and I also teach the senior level diversity experience before they go into student teaching. And so what I'm seeing is that, you know, the students from when they're first year and then when they get to the diversity experience, they haven't grown much or changed much in terms of understanding diversity. And you know, I think they're a little bit more mature about dealing with it by the time they get to be seniors. But as first year students, they're coming from high school. They've never been taught some of these things, and I feel like it's, you know, I think it's important that I present these things so that they can understand them. And hopefully that will help them over the next 4 years of their education to be able to change their thinking. But, you know, and I've had some students in the past year who really are kind of primed for social justice issues and who I feel really confident about these being students that are going to go out and they're going to change things. And I started to think about how are we going to get to a point where these perspectives are different, you know, and in terms of, I mean, I kind of thought about it in relation to what I've studied about the residential boarding schools and how they felt they could educate the Indian out of the, you know, out of them and to turn them into what they wanted to mold them into. Um, and I thought, I wonder if it's a matter of educating educating students, and just if you keep on that path, you will start to change people's minds, and those people will teach kids and they will change their minds. And so, you know, is that where we start? Do we start by presenting the information, making sure students know how important it is, and then to give them an outlet for that, to get them started on the path of taking action? Oh, so the bill, I had not seen the bill in Ohio, and I would say since we're a private institution, it wouldn't. I mean, I think college professors in general are pretty, uh, you know, we definitely want to have control over the things that we teach, and so we don't like to have people tell us we can't. So I don't specifically teach critical race theory, although critical race theory is behind the way I teach and the way I approach my students. I mean, I do that with an understanding. So I don't think it would impact us. No. But that's a good question. And that's, you know, I'll be honest, seeing these things on Facebook and other, you know, I have a couple of different Instagram sites that I follow. One of them, if you're interested, it's called Anti-Racist Education Now, all one word. And they have a lot of really interesting slideshows and posters about issues like this. You know, that's one of the things that came across the other day is that if you, you know, this connection between banning critical race theory and then, you know, systemic inequalities, right? That, you know, here, you don't want to talk about race, or you don't want to let us talk or teach about race. And how that feeds into this systemic inequality that exists and will continue to exist. You know, we're not all leftists. I mean, some of us are, but I mean, when I think a lot of times in education, when you hear the term leftist, it immediately attaches to indoctrination, and so that's what I mean with that. We are not trying to indoctrinate children, right? We are trying to open people's minds to see different perspectives, and um, that can, doing that can kind of shake up the comfortability with the power structure. if that makes any sense.
Mhm.
But I appreciate you saying that. I mean, that's definitely, it is the power structure. And until, originally it was 2040, or 2030. I don't know if it's still 2030 when, whites are going to be the minority. And I think that's something that frightens some people as well. But I yeah, it's getting that, and I think I really do think it's power that corrupts, because when you have power, that's the only thing that you're afraid of losing, and it becomes, well, not that I've had much power in life, but I can see where that would be. Once you have it, you don't want to let go of it, and there's probably a fear of what happens if it's taken from you. um
Well,
you're,
that power and so forth that you're talking about has been the common theme and backdrop of all through our civilization.
yep,
I mean,
exactly.
in the early days, you had the plantation owners, you had the industrialists, the robber barons. I mean, that power and control has always been an impediment toward a total free society and upward movement of a lot of people.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. And that, yeah, so I mean, I think that's something that needs to be investigated and understood better, and maybe it needs to be understood better by those in power as well.
Oh, I think they understand it very well.
Yeah, well, yeah, you're right. Yeah, and that's where the fear comes in, that
Yeah.
they don't want to lose that. And I look at it and say, if the tables were turned, and maybe this is another thing too. I always believe in being good to people because I want people to be good to me. You know what I mean? That I don't ever want to hurt anybody. I want to be as supportive as I can. I want to understand what other people are going through. And another thing that I touched on, but we didn't really talk a great deal about, is that this idea of individualism. And in native tribes, I remember reading a story about Sitting Bull when he was on the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and he ended up in New York with that. And he was walking down the street, and he found a boy that was panhandling for money. And he shook his head and he wrote, that would never happen in a native community, because that is, they're collectivists. I mean, that is what they do. They make sure that everybody in their communities are taken care of. So there's this idea of an orphan is not anything that would ever happen in a native community, because they all come together. And so one of the things that made me think about was, relate that to things happening in society today, and then also um, the fact that not a whole lot gets done in Congress. And I thought, I heard one of my friends say, why can't they just compromise? And it occurred to me, we have become way too individualist as a country in order to be able to see other perspectives. So, we many of us don't have the ability to compromise because we're so connected to and tied to the things that we want. And hopefully with politicians, that's the desires of their constituency. But as you pointed out, most likely it's what they want, what's going to get them ahead, not necessarily what is going to benefit the country. So I think that is a big issue that needs to be explored, that idea of you're on your own, right? um, and you see this with federal programs. This idea of self-reliance, as a cultural, a basic American cultural value, meaning white cultural value. Self-reliance was really important, and so it makes sense to me why there are people who are upset about people being on welfare, um, because they're looking at it and saying they're not self-reliant. That's viewing it through a white cultural lens. It's not viewing it through the lens of a different perspective, right? So I think, you know, this idea of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but we're not going to give you any boots. Right?
I think we're going to be cut off pretty soon. So can I throw in one last thing?
Absolutely.
I think we need more women in government.
Yeah.
Get rid of a lot of the old boys clubs. I mean, the men are about power and money and control,
Yeah.
and the women are more empathetic. I mean, that's go back to the Indian cultures. The women ran the villages, the men did the hunting.
That is exactly right. Yeah. Yeah.
And that pleasant blend kind of made for a much balanced society for them, and it would help us a lot more if more women were in there to get rid of the old boys clubs.
Yep. I'm with you there.
I mean, I'm not just saying that from, I'm sympathetic with the feminist movements, but
Right.
it makes sense.
Yeah.
Because it works.
And that was interesting because I remember somebody. I follow a lot of Native sites as well, and one of the things that, you know, one of the things that was posted was, we need to have a Native president so this person can bring things into balance.
That would do it. In
Yeah.
fact, a chief could not become a chief of the tribe unless he had the support of the matrons.
That's exactly right. And they were collectivists. They worked together instead of working on their own. So yeah, excellent point.
Wow. This has been a really excellent discussion. And just so you know, Jim, there's really no electronic time limit on the meeting. We could go on forever. But we do try to be respectful of the time that we commit to. So I really appreciate the conversation and the discussion. Marilyn, excellent presentation. As Dr. Allison just pointed out, you've given us a lot to think about. I won't try to recap your entire presentation, but it did bring to mind a couple of things that I want to emphasize to folks. One is that you did an excellent job at the beginning, of course, of reminding us of a common thread that we've seen in the previous presentations, reminding us that we look at other people's cultures through the lens of our own, which we have been focused on primarily for most of our lives. So I think it was important for you that you pointed that out. A couple of other things I just want to mention quickly. I think you did a good job of kind of capturing the idea that race and the racial construct is not only specific to African Americans, but also pointing out that Africans were not voluntary immigrants. I think sometimes that gets kind of lost in the wash. And then the last two things that I was thinking as we were hearing the discussion, one is that whenever I hear about the Declaration of Independence and then the Emancipation Proclamation, kind of that whole timeline, and you mentioned several things that you said sometimes are either obscured or totally left out of history as it's presented. And that is, I asked people to go back and take a look at a letter that Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley a few months prior to the Emancipation Proclamation that I think reflected very succinctly his real view on slaves and freeing of slaves and why. And I encourage people to just take a look at that. I think it was August or so of 1862, which is a few months before the emancipation. But the last thing that I want us to think about, and I know I say every time how great this is and how I really want us to get more people to participate and share the links that Heather created for us, to push those links out so people can view it. But I can only say it this way, Marilyn. I wish that I could have 1,000 people in the room to hear the very beginning when you captured, I think, in this one statement, how did we get here? We've been here all along. We've been here the whole time. There's been a lot of things said and done. A lot of people have bled and died and fought and all those things. And it looks a little different, honestly, than it did. Like you just pointed out, we were not there in the 1400s or 1600s or 1800s. But I totally agree. The reality is where we are is where we've always been, for all the reasons that you just pointed out. So I appreciate that. And I really, again, encourage everyone to share the links, to really encourage the folks in your circle and outside your circle to take a look at what we're offering here. This is good stuff that I know is not happening in some other communities. the surface conversations that I call them are not a bad thing, but they're not pushing people to think differently and encourage their community members to think differently about where we are in this country. And I think what we're doing is absolutely advocating that kind of thinking that needs to happen. So I appreciate Marilyn. I appreciate all of you for participating and being here throughout the presentation on Thursday evening. So we will see you on July 15th at this time, when our presenter will be Dr. Danielle Gregory, who's going to talk to us about where we are, right? So Marilyn has given us a good education and a good framework to think about how we got here. So Dr. Gregory is going to talk to us about where we are. And then after that, in the following month, we're going to hear from the Coriels about allyship and where we could be going headed forward. So I appreciate all of you and have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Bye.